lots of good options, and you want to avoid the asymmetric downside, anything that can basically end the game, whether it's through financial ruin or reputational ruin or through physical ruin. And of course, you want to expose yourself to things that can suddenly turn in, not suddenly, but, can become massively important for you, non-linearities on the upside, so to speak. So that requires a certain amount of chaos and spontaneity. Like a regimented life is like a heartbeat that's like, non-chaotic. It's like system that is too ordered. It doesn't have any life to it. And real life has lots and lots of ups and downs, some of them very extreme. In the digital and mental domains or the social domains, you can have massive nonlinear spikes in either direction. One moment the whole world is rejoicing like you're just a giant boom, and the next moment the whole world is cowering in fear because some exponential virus got out of control, right? Or the way things spread on social media, or the way look at Bitcoin price parabolically down and then parabolically up. So planning is generally, the way we think about planning is it's very linear, it's very controlled. It's like, I'm going to spend this many hours doing this and that many days doing that. And, last year I made X, so this year I'll make X plus 20% or progress and whatever I care about. But that's not really how the world around us works anymore. The world is dominated by non-linearities. So understanding option value and optionality is far more important, and building a series of a basket of options, positive options, and avoiding the basket of negative options is really what it's all about. And if nothing else, 2020 should have taught you the power of optionality.
Motivate. A follow-up question? I guess it was Darren. Darren's gone. All right, let me invite some other folks up to stage. Naval, how's your night been?
Yeah. pretty easy.
It's hard to have a follow-up to Naval because he always has the mic drop.
Yeah, I actually physically throw my phone down every time. It gets expensive.
So adjacent to the earlier topic of leverage is the idea of high signal. And so as you were chatting, I tweeted something. I said, the law of internet bios. The longer their bio, the less they've accomplished.
It was personal, Julian. It was personal.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of right. I mean, Elon doesn't need a bio, right? He just needs a name, Elon or Oprah or any kind of single name characters who are widely known. But yeah, that's generally right. In fact, same is true of credentialing, right? When you see people on Twitter with MBA or PhD or MD or whatever in their Twitter name, it's not quite having the effect that I think they're hoping it will.
It's funny because it's like if they acknowledge the truth, they would know that. Like, I don't think anyone denies that. It's kind of a game that everyone plays. But it's kind of like startups that send you a long investor update as an investor with no numbers in it. Like, they just tell this insanely beautiful story of the narrative and the user and the customer stories with no numbers. And then you ask for that. And,
Well, in my experience, the really successful companies that you invest in, most of them don't even send numbers. They're too busy. They don't send updates. They don't do anything. Yeah. I think it's not. Yeah. Obviously, it's not causative. It doesn't mean if you stop sending numbers that you'll be successful. But generally, the most successful companies, the founders are too busy to even lean on their investors. When the investors show up, it's almost a nuisance. The investors are circling to put more money into the company. They aren't necessarily being helpful because there's just nothing to do. The thing has product market fit, so it's a rocket, and it's all the team can do but to keep up. And a part-time investor just can't help that much, at least at certain stages of product market fit.
Do you not feel that more context, color, texture, and I guess exposure and availability and accessibility to a product, brand, mission statement, journey, adventure, story adds value? Or do you feel that like the value is not necessarily needing to be added if what you see is what you get and the work speaks for you? As someone that's like all about keeping it short and saying more with less, I also find beauty in the details and the context and the character associated with that. So I kind of like the people that overemphasize and everything checks out. Obviously, if it doesn't, then it's almost overcompensating and it works adversely, like you said.
I think it depends on the intention. There's a lot of clubhouse bios where people are enriching they're magnifying every little thing they've accomplished, and it's clearly in pursuit of trying to signal competency or accomplishment. And in that case, it looks pretty bad. But if you're painting a canvas, or you're just providing surface area for people to be able to spark a conversation with you because you're sharing your interests, I think that's pretty cool. So I think the intent winds up being very obvious on quick read.
Well, I think like a strong bio might be a little bit like a strong essay or a strong story, which is the first sentence should make you curious. That's a hallmark of very often of a good story. The first sentence immediately inspires curiosity and then gets you to read the rest of it. And I would guess it's similar with bios. If you're going to have a multi-sentence bio, the first one should probably make the reader curious. And then after that, you want to fulfill that curiosity. And you could do it either within that bio or you could give them a link. And, nothing speaks like having a custom domain. So for those of you who are into self-branding, and let's face it, most of you are, or you wouldn't be on social media, and I'm guilty of that as well, then a personal branded domain is a big deal because it signals a level of seriousness that other people just don't have. Now, that said, you have to be, a little cognizant of what you put into that domain. Don't necessarily make it a shrine to yourself. That would be a little absurd and signal the wrong thing. See, social signaling is such a complex thing. What we're basically doing, all of us are doing here, and what we're essentially doing all the time that we're not busy trying to make money or meet our most basic needs is we're just bidding for status, right? We're always trying to increase our status. And bidding for status is a very difficult thing because if you directly seek status by talking yourself up, well, that's a low status move because it means that you are nervous about your position in the social hierarchy. And because status is so much of it is based on perception and confidence, if you are signaling that you are unsure of your own status, then why should I grant that you have high status? So bidding for status overtly is a low signal move. So it's a low status move. So what we're always doing as humans, we're in social groups, is we're always bidding for status, but we're doing it in ways that A, don't look like we're trying for status, and B, are adding value to the whole group overall, to the group dynamic, the group mentality, so that the group then confers some status and says, yes, this person is worthy of being a leader or worthy of following. And it's a very tricky game. So bios are part of that because you have to also accurately know your own status. So for example, if you have like a one-liner bio that's sort of dismissive, but you're a nobody, then people will say, okay, this person's a pretender. They're unaware. They don't even know their own status. Who the heck is this person trying to fake it? At the same time, if you write a bio that's too big, then you come across as a tryhard. So there is an art form to it. And a lot of it is like, again, knowing what the group knows and you know about the group and what you know about yourself. So very often we see this with people who either are too humble, and you almost don't believe them, or they brag too much, and then you kind of know that that's a low status move.
It's like, act like you don't care and they will come back. No, I'm just kidding. Well, so the highest status thing possible is to not care. If you look at the absolute highest status human beings in human history, it's like Jesus and Buddha. They're beyond mortal needs and mortal cares. Or you could even go to Vladimir Putin. When Time magazine interviewed him as Time Person of the Year, I remember he cut the interview short and walked away. And they basically wrote like he's the only person we've interviewed who just didn't care whether he was Time Person of the Year or not. I mean, that's real power. So genuine apathy actually is a very strong, credible signal that you have so won the game that you've stepped out of it altogether. That's the highest status move. That said, it cannot be faked. You can't show any neediness whatsoever. So if you're in that position, then you truly do stand alone. You don't care what other people do or think. And you have to signal that in your every move, because if you show a moment of weakness, then you're a faker and you're going to crash back down to a needy tryhard, which is actually a very low status place to be. It's the kind of
Naval, I recall you saying either on Tim Ferriss's podcast or your own that building a personal brand around your name is one of the best things you can do. And I'm building a brand right now, and I won't advertise for myself, but that's something that I've been considering a lot, and I've been getting other people to tell me different. And part of that is because I'm I'm a professional in the medical dental space, and I'm wondering if there's a risk at all to my license or being targeted in such a way that I should worry about that using my name. And I'm wondering, maybe the audience has some similar concerns, but I do recall you talking about that on other podcasts or other platforms. And I'm curious if you think that still applies in this context.
Well, using your own name is a very audacious move. It will annoy people. Who is this monkey to stand out over the other monkeys and say that his name is worth something? So it's very audacious. It's not something you're ever going to get a lot of back patting for and a lot of people cheering you on. It's a high accountability move. You're taking risk. You're overtly and publicly taking the risk of humiliation. And frankly, if you are not confident enough in your own abilities to publicly take the risk of humiliation, then you don't deserve the status that comes with being a leader. Essentially, a leader is someone who makes a bid for status and succeeds. If you bid for status and you fail, then you're thrown in the back of the pack. So you have to show that you're worthy, and obviously there are many ways to show you're worthy, but they require actually giving to the group and the community in some overt, sacrificing, or intelligent way. But if you're not willing to take the risk of stepping up there, then you absolutely are not worthy of being a leader. A leader, by definition, sticks his or her neck out. And so if you want to have the brand around your name, then you literally cannot care what other people think. That said, I don't necessarily think you should go out there and start stamping your name on everything. That is also a little bit of a low status, needy move, right? And there are people who have managed to do it somewhat successfully in the business world, like Trump was famous for it before he became president. He would just stamp Trump on a bunch of things. And that was supposed to signal high quality or high whatever. But generally, you don't want to build a name just around building a name. That's like the lowest status move. Like if I said, or it's like Kanye or Nike, I take that back. Kanye is actually obviously a good singer and performer, right? So that's why he got the name. So you want to get the name brand by doing something else. So you don't set out to brand yourself by saying, hey, I'm going to build a brand around my name and I'm going to be famous. That's a low status move, and it's not a very humble move. But what you can do is you can say, hey, I'm going to be the best in the world at X, and I'm going to put it under my name so people know whether it's good or whether it's terrible, that's me, right? Then you're taking on accountability and you're taking risk. So I would say, you don't brand yourself. That's sort of a nonsense concept. You do something that is worthwhile, and then you are willing to stick your neck out by putting your name on it. And if it's great, then people will remember you. And if you're terrible, then people will blame you. But you're taking a risk, and you have to take that risk. You cannot look for validation from other people anytime that you are sticking your neck out. It's just not the way the world works. If being a leader, if taking risks to become famous or successful or wealthy, if any of these things were socially applauded, then we'd all be there. We wouldn't have to stand around wondering about it. But all of these things require going against the grain, going against the crowd. You're never going to have the crowd's approval while you're doing anything truly worthwhile. That's just my view on the world.
Well, it's too late then too, right? Like the minute it's publicly, I like to think that like I'm average in the sense that like my success rate is roughly proportional to how many competitors I have, right? Like each competitor has like an equivalent chance of winning. And so like I want to pick games that have as few competitors as possible. And one way to do that is like, pick a difficult game, pick a game that feels like play to me, work to others, etc., to sort of minimize that from happening. 100%. Thank you so much for the feedback, and I totally and 100% agree with you that I'm not at all trying to go out and brand my name to make it famous. I in fact I don't. It's going to happen anyway too, right? Like if you build a company, your name will. You can name the Twitter is not called Jack, but everyone knows Jack, right? So like it will happen. The beauty of the internet, or is it's just built in. It's built into the system.
Sure. An example there would be like Linus and Linux, right? Now, well, the beauty of that is it's named after Linus. I don't believe he named it. I think maybe other people might have named it that, or maybe he was just doing it for themselves. But it wasn't like this self-aggrandizing, chest thumping. Look at me, I made Linux. But it's indelibly branded with his name. And so whether it succeeds or fails, if Linux is a big smoking pile of crap, then it's always going to stick to his name. But if it's a huge success, like it turned out to be, then that's also going to stick to his name. So that's a pretty good example of personal branding involving a product.
Another good thing to look at in that sense is Tom York and all the Radiohead albums being an individual LLC, just under their name, just in case there was any form of liability or risk associated with any of those products, from sample clearance to, or products, any of the music and the peripheral products and merchandising and apparel that came along with it. If there were any issues of any form of lawsuit or legal contingent problem, it would be absolved, and it wouldn't reflect upon the Tom York name, but it would reflect upon the Radiohead individual LLC of that project. So it's also like a very good move for protection. And I think that, Kanye is a perfect example of somebody, like, he posted his 2016 contract that he's trying to bring into 2021, but in the interim, you don't see much music coming out under Kanye West. You see it coming out under Sunday Service. You see it coming out under Yeezy. You see projects like Yeezus. You see the iterations in the same way that Diddy and Sean Combs and so on and so forth have done. And each one has its own value. Each one is checked out with dotting its I's and crossing its T's and going through the legal loops. So in turn, it's a very smart move for protection. And if it all comes back because your brand is strong enough anyways, you are the seed to the tree, to the branches that those names are.
So something I'm interested to see, like, as a kind of that comes out of Naval's question and Gray's question, is like, are we going to see non-specific, like non-individual human name brands getting built by individuals? Are we going to see like more and more anonymous millionaires and billionaires able to build brands almost secretly and like entire careers under pseudonyms?
Well, what's interesting is that mediums like Clubhouse are changing that calculus a little bit. Like, you could have built an anonymous bot brand on Twitter. It's very hard to do that on Clubhouse because this is a real identity-based system, and of course there's a human voice attached to it. The same way, you could have had a brand account on Twitter, like, let's say, like Wendy's, famously run by like the Wendy's social media manager, who's very clever. But on Twitter, like, you'd know that person, and the moment Wendy's tried to switch that person out for somebody else, you would immediately know. Sorry, on Clubhouse. So Clubhouse in this live chat format forces a level of authenticity that I think we all as humans crave, which you can't get on the other social media platforms. This is truly a person-to-person platform. And
live performance is really interesting because it's the hardest thing to fake. Like, if you think about almost any art form, like, what is the hardest thing to fake? It's the live performances, right? It's like, if you compare the live Steve Jobs keynotes, it's like the height, the pinnacle. Why? Because it was the most performed, right? And ever since then, it's gone less and less performing. Now it's totally recorded. And Clubhouse,
it's like people, who get impressed by GPT-3 Twitter. And I always view that as like a Turing test for the person getting impressed. If you get impressed by GPT-3 Twitter, then you just fail the Turing test. But on Clubhouse, there's no way GPT-3 would stand a chance, right? It would start talking, and within 2 sentences, you realize it's gibberish. So you're right; it's unfakeable.
Yeah, I remember, like, I moved to Provo and took a science fiction fantasy writing class, and the one of the first things Brandon Sanderson, teacher, said, he was like, everyone will know you're good. Like, the fact that you're a good writer or not. I mean, this goes actually back to the bio thing. It's obvious in the first sentence. I can, in one sentence, know if you're an amazing writer or not. In 3 seconds of listening to a pianist, you'll know if they're a master or not. Like, it's such an accelerated pace of learning, which I think goes back to the bio thing. Like, the fact that it needs to take you more than 3 seconds means you're not a master. Now you are making up, like, now you are selling me. Now I'm on your sales page effectively, before I get to the email subscription.
Yeah, the person in charge generally doesn't have to say much, right? They can be quiet when they enter the room.
Yeah, it's a thing. It's a thing that kind of funnily compounds as well, because you don't have to do it, and so you continue to get credit for not doing it. And all the people who status signal, it's sort of like the rich get richer of status. Like, just just honoring your current status position will reinforce it.
Well, high status is a difficult place to be. It's like being the gladiator in the middle of the arena who's killed a bunch of the other gladiators. Now every newcomer wants to challenge you. So if you have high status, then you're always going to be getting weird questions, getting attacks, getting all kinds of people essentially bidding for status by trying to go to war with you. And one of the things you learn early on, when you have social status, is that you don't want to pick fights with people because there's always a new challenger. There's always somebody who wants to duel you. So you just have to get very, very good at ignoring people who are trying to always create fights. So high status is a very precarious position. High wealth is actually a much safer position. Obviously, intrinsically self-contained is the best position, but if you want to get to some stability in your life, high wealth is far more stable than high status.
We were talking earlier about leverage and how it's sort of, Eric, I'd love if you could elaborate as, remind us how you talked about it, but it's sort of like people have to give it to you. Like it's sort of centralized, it's not freedom. It's kind of the opposite of freedom. And I'm curious, like Naval, how do you think about how do you get leverage, but also in sort of a decentralized way? It might mean you're pseudonymous, no one knows you are. What does that future look like where you have...
we live in the age of incredible, infinite permissionless leverage. Clubhouse is permissionless leverage. Anyone can jump on here and start talking. And if you're saying something interesting, you will build a following really, really quickly. Look, I jump on Clubhouse all the time. And what I do is I go through all the rooms. I listen for 10 seconds into each room. And I'm like, is this person saying something really smart and teaching me something? And if they are, great, I'll stick around. And if they're doing a really good job, I'll follow them. As you said, it's an unfakeable signal. So this is a prime example of how if you are an incredible thinker or speaker or you have some great insight, you will build up a following more quickly and more efficiently on Clubhouse than on almost any other medium that came before. If you're a great musical performer, perhaps you have a chance with TikTok. Or if you're a really funny comedian type, maybe you're good on YouTube. Whatever it is. But this is the era of permissionless leverage. Now, if you want to crank that up one more level, you can learn to code, and now you can have a little army of robots doing that, helping you out as well. So between media, books, podcasts, and code, we have so much permissionless leverage that all the new fortunes are created through permissionless leverage. It's the old world fortunes where you needed to either have a big hedge fund, a lot of capital that other people gave you, or the worst kind of leverage is labor, where you just have lots and lots of people working for you. But those forms of leverage, I think, are very outmoded. And it kind of boggles my mind. Like, for example, I was touring a construction site the other day. There was like a house that was being built. And as I'm going through it, the workers are working on different parts of the house. And you look at a house and it's so complicated to build a house. It is unbelievably complicated. And it's a lot of work. It's like heavy lifting. And it just kind of blew my mind that these people basically got paid less than someone who's sipping coffee and writing code a couple hours a day. But at the same time, you have to realize that what they're doing is permission leverage, right? It's a lot of labor involved. It's sort of well known how to do that. So the creative side of it is mostly gone. It's mostly just execution. And it's only a matter of time before they get replaced by machines and robots. Obviously, some trades go sooner than others. And they don't really get replaced. They get augmented so they can build more houses, etc. But someone who has permissionless leverage, like someone who knows how to code, or someone who's fast on their feet and good at podcasting or clubhousing or Twitter or whatever social media, just has infinite permissionless leverage compared to one of these people, and they get to exercise creativity. So even though what they're doing seems more fun and less effort, they're actually going to be rewarded much more for it in the marketplace.
I think what's interesting more so on Clubhouse than how quickly you can accrue followers is the depth of affinity you accrue them at. So there's this notion of layers of multimedia. So if I send a tweet, it's purely text. People kind of remember the tweet, less so associated with who said it. But if I'm now on Clubhouse, I'm associating my voice and my personality inseparably from the content of my words. And so the memory storage, when people remember this conversation right now, they can recall the conversation that I'm having right now much better in a year from now and half a year from now, if they're able to. And so I think the depth of affinity you get when people feel like they know you goes a really long way on Clubhouse. And so it's more than just a fractional follower in terms of their recall.
So the human brain, is a holographic memory machine. It stores memories through different trigger points and can retrieve roughly the same memory through one of several different triggers. And so if you're memorizing something, for example, you want to do it in multiple ways. For example, if you have to memorize some complicated number, one way to do it is you count it out in your fingers. Then you write it down, you stare at the writing. Then maybe you type it out and you stare at the typing. Then maybe you say it out loud to yourself a bunch of times. And that sort of helps helps you build a memory around it. You could even build what's called a memory castle, which is like this mental construct where you walk around your fake little castle and putting the numbers or letters in different places and having a visual 3D representation. So the same way, if you are building a message, you're building media or messaging or a brand online, it's better if you approach it multimodally. If people get to see your short form writing, like on Twitter, they get to read a blog post from you once in a while, they get to hear a podcast, they get to hear you in Clubhouse, they get to see you on YouTube. Every single one of those things is going to reinforce your message in a slightly different way. One of the weird things about being a so-called public intellectual, and I really don't want to be that thing, whatever that is, but is that you can say the same thing over and over and over and over again. And if you say it just slightly differently, most people will be quite interested because it's helping them see it from different angles, helping them remember it. Of course, there's always a few people who'll be like, oh, he's just repeating himself. But then those cynics and critics are everywhere. But I do think that there's something to multimodal messaging if you really want to get a message out.
The multimodal messaging also introduces a much tighter empathy feedback loop. So when people can in real time hear how you're reacting to their potential attack, it re-triggers that in-person idea, that in-person notion rather, of like, oh wait, I'm actually being too aggressive, too confrontational. So I think when you close that loop, it also just increases empathy. And it's like a shortcut. This medium over text is a shortcut for building affinity, empathy, and recall. And if you go one level higher, you have video, which I think is probably the long form video is basically the pinnacle of, okay, 2 hours listening to someone on Joe Rogan. I feel like I know this person much better than, seeing Naval say purely via his tweets for 2 years.
Well, and the highest form of that is just in person. Oh, sorry. Go Sweden.
Go ahead, Sahil.
Well, the ultimate form of this is just in person, right? Like the ideal way to build an audience is one by one in person, like Jesus did. So I just think it's like all of technology, like the path of technology is basically making it more and more permissionless. Like it's basically just increasing permissionless leverage, which is just the idea that you should be able to do anything you want, whatever you want, whenever you want, right? That's just permissionless. Like when you're talking about building a house, you should be able to just like move your hands and like the house should just appear out of thin air. That would be ideal. That would be permissionless leverage, but you can't do that yet. And that's what, it's just getting easier. Like it's sort of another way to predict the future. Like why is Clubhouse a thing? It's like, well, eventually humans want higher fidelity ways to communicate with each other at scale. We want to have that in-person conversation. At some point, it will be in VR. It'll be, it'll feel like reality. Or whatever, sci-fi sort of stuff. But that's sort of the eventual. It seems like we either blow ourselves up or that is an eventuality.
That's sometimes it's good to look at an absurd endpoint of something as a thought exercise, just to kind of understand what the point means. So, like the absurd endpoint of leverage. And sorry if I'm repeating myself. For those of you who hate it when I repeat myself, but it's omniscience is omnipotence. So if you know everything, then you are also all powerful as a consequence. If you knew exactly what particle to push or what grain of sand to flick in which direction, you knew how that would what the repercussions of that would be all the way down the line, you wouldn't need to do anything. You could literally just wave your hand and then the particles would collide in the right way and the right things would happen. In complexity theory, it's called the butterfly effect. But if you had knowledge over that, now that of course is impossible for any finite creature, so we don't have that level of omnipotence, but at some absurd level, knowledge is power, and pure knowledge is the ultimate form of leverage. So all leverage basically tends towards knowledge. So this is kind of why I also believe that success in anything is just a byproduct of learning. And learning is just a byproduct of curiosity. So ultimately, if you are curious about something, you will be successful at it. And the more curious you are about it, the more successful you will be at it. So if your overwhelming desire is to figure out how to make money and how that works, then you'll make money. If your overwhelming desire is to figure out how or why people are happy and how to be happy, you'll be happy. But it's got to be kind of your overwhelming thing. So learning knowledge literally is power, but the mechanism through which it achieves power is through leverage.
I wonder if just combining like Naval's comments with what Sahil said about like the ultimate form of leverage being one-to-one, and what Julian said about, the high empathy kind of forms of media being, video where you can see and feel people's kind of subtle changes, and one-on-one is best because you can react to them. What we give up with our scaled kind of forms of media now is just the inability to feel the audience react or to customize anything. And I wonder if our next big evolution, our next big leap forward is going to be some sort of technology. It was like technology as a placeholder word for what that technology actually is, that allows us to, like, at scale provide deeply reactive media. Whether it's almost like the Neil Stephenson, like, tablet from the Diamond Age, right? It's a super, super reactive form of recorded media that lets us reach the audience deeply one-to-one, wherever their circumstance is.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the basic Clubhouse feature where we can tell if the audience is interested in what you're saying or not, right? In the real world, audiences, the equivalent is a boo or an applause, or maybe for a concert, they light some candles or they cheer or what have you, but there's no equivalent on Clubhouse yet. And so there's no feedback loop. Now, you're also talking about taking it one level further, which is using technology to create a one-to-one mapping from the speaker to the listener, even when it's a mass audience. I think that's hard to do authentically. Like, yeah, you could probably code up a Cyber Sahil or Cyber Julian, and then that Cyber Julian can sort of talk to people. But I think it's going to have the GPT-3 problem again, right? It's not truly sentient. It's not truly Sahil or Julian. So it's not going to be an authentic experience. And I think humans crave and understand authenticity. And when we get something that is trying to be authentic but failing, that's kind of the worst. I think we automatically reject fakers or poor attempts very, very extremely.
The emotional uncanny valley.
Exactly. I want to use that phrase, but I don't want to confuse you. But you're right. It's exactly an uncanny valley. Uncanny valley is mostly using computer graphics, where you have a 3D image of someone's face, and it's almost that person, but not quite. And it just gives you the heebie-jeebies. It's kind of creepy. So yeah, it's pretty important, I think, to be authentic. And I just don't see how you scale, how you convert one-to-many to one-to-one without losing the authenticity.
So what I find really interesting is what makes somebody a very compelling real-time extemporaneous speaker. I'm just riffing here for a moment, but I think there might be two components. I think one is, almost ironically, empathy for the audience. And perhaps not ironic, but here's what I mean. If you can project yourself as an audience member and listen to yourself in real time, if you can run that parallel thread, you can say, Julian, you're really fucking boring right now. So it's figuring out this emotional roller coaster of what people are feeling as you're talking. I think that is one component. I think another component is being able to synthesize ideas very quickly. So if you can reflexively kind of combine two things folks are saying on stage, and you don't have to sit there and premeditate it, I think that's purely biological, that second component. I think the first, however, can be trained. I've heard both Sahil and Naval speak to this, and Robbie, I know this is your area of expertise, so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts there.
Sure, happy to jump in. I mean, when it comes to extemporaneous speaking, right, the first thing is always keeping your audience in mind, and I think you really hit on that, Julian, right? We're trying to connect with them emotionally. If we can have some sort of emotional effect on who we're speaking to, that's what's going to ultimately drive that immediate signal when they're listening to you that, hey, this person has something of value that I want to continue to listen to. Then it comes down to just simply being able to stay organized in your mind as you're thinking through the different things that you want to say and structuring them in that moment.
Let me just interrupt. I mean, I would say, going back to status games, it's the highest form of status is to not care. So
I was just about to say, like, I don't give a rat's ass what the audience is feeling. I'm talking for myself.
Yeah, me too. Fuck everybody. No, yeah, I think that the goal is to just talk and be interesting in a way that you can't fake because you're performing live. You're sort of proving this fact, and then you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, the rarest thing, everyone is trying to figure out what everybody else wants to hear. That's not rare. That's common. What's rare is saying things that are true that either other people haven't thought through fully before, or things that other people don't dare to say. Those are the things.
I would push back a little bit too on the interaction component. Like, I think Clubhouse forces that sort of, it makes it easier for us to forget that there are other people. So it's like it sort of makes it easier for us to jump.
That's right. Clubhouse is designed to make you and I think that we're having an intimate, private conversation, and then letting thousands of people eavesdrop in. That's literally the whole design of the system. That's why I think they don't allow recordings, or they say not to allow recordings without everyone's permission, because they want to make it feel like it's a casual conversation, when of course it's anything but that.
So basically, say what you think is interesting for yourself, pursue novelty, and if it interests you, it'll interest a significant portion of the audience. So it's kind of
forget the audience. No,
or it won't.
Don't pay any attention to the audience. Don't pay attention to the followers. If you're speaking for the audience is worthless. If you're writing for followers, your followers are worthless. This is
think about any other sport. Like, think about a sport. Do they play for their audience? No, they play to win. That is literally the only reason that they're on the field, is to win. And so, like, if you want these people to play the best, you put them in a bubble with no audience.
Playing for the audience is also inauthentic, and people, even though the people will deep down detect that, someone who's playing to the audience will eventually be boring to the audience.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. I really like that framework. That resonates. Part of it also, I think, is just the authenticity of having a conversation with a buddy, like you guys are referring to. The more you can let.
It's also about risk, I think. Like, it's risky to talk about the things that are in your head when you haven't talked about them before, you haven't performed them hundreds and hundreds of times. Like, when you're reading a script, and there's obviously, this is a spectrum, so you can have things that you've never talked about. You have you have your bits that you go to. I think it's actually very similar to sort of stand-up comedy. But I think it's about the risk. It's about the fact, this is why live performance is interesting, even though you can go listen to an album and it's higher quality. You don't have to go to a music festival. Is because you're like, it's the risk involved. And,
it's risky. It's hard to be interesting for long periods of time. Most people cannot speak extemporaneously on many topics and synthesize them on the fly, as Robbie was saying and Julian was saying. These are difficult talents. So what ends up happening is most people, when they have to go live, they end up resorting to talking about politics, news, weather, sports, because these are things that are also live. So there's always you can always say the old things again in a new way about new data. So talk radio tends to degenerate into those categories. But now, if you get out of those categories, what remains? If you want someone to just talk extemporaneously live, there are very, very few people who can do that for long periods of time and stay interesting, right? Most of the few remaining ones you'll find are in comedy, and even those are heavily rehearsed, right? A good comedian rehearses their jokes over and over, but a good comedian is a good speaker. They're witty. What are they doing? They're telling the truth, the uncomfortable truth, in a way that they can get away with it, right? They're showing how to be brave in front of an audience and not get, hit by the mob. It's a classic role of the jester. And so, it's hard to be interesting for long periods of time, and most people can't do it. So you end up with professional comedians being the very small class that can do it. Now, so if you look at talk radio, there's a Howard Sterns of the world, which are basically comedians. And Joe Rogan, right? There's the news people of the world, very often in extreme politics, right? So they always something new to talk about. Rush Limbaugh, who just recently passed away, was one of these characters. Or you have sportscasters. But outside of that, talk radio is really tough. So Clubhouse, how's Clubhouse trying to tackle that? Well, one thing Clubhouse does is it throws multiple people in a room, right? Second is it's unscheduled. Like, I don't have a Naval show. I don't have to show up at a specific time and always perform. I can leave when I'm bored, or I can turn over the heavy lifting to Sahil or to somebody else. Sahil actually called me into this room, which is why I'm here. And so there are ways to kind of mitigate these
status games. That was a status game right there.
It was.
So he was getting winded. He was
this format is hilarious, because the moment I come in, my followers get notified that my followers show up. Some of them stick to you. So of course you want me in your room, because I suck in a whole host of followers, right? That you then leech off of. So what have you done for me lately, Sahil?
I'm working on Angelus Rolling Fund, everybody.
I know. But I show up because Sahil is interesting to talk to, right? He's one of the few people that I can riff with for long periods of time, and he'll say something interesting. I might learn something that I get a kick out of. So here I am. It's a bait, right? You set the bait, and here I am. But even Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is a stand-up comedian. He's a really funny guy. He's a really interesting guy. He's got lots of opinions and everything. But even Joe doesn't make the Joe Rogan podcast about Joe Rogan. He's interviewing people, because at some point you just run out of things to talk about. So you need somebody else to riff with. And so I just think the Clubhouse phenomenon is going to be interesting. Now, there are a few people in human history who can just talk and talk and talk on their own about whatever their favorite topic is, and they will inspire lots of people. There aren't many of those people, but those are the people that create movements, right? Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Hitler. These are people who are Trump. Yeah, these are people who can riff extemporaneously for long periods of time, and their audience, who is aligned with them, will forgive the foibles, understand the broader message, and then get really, really unified behind this person. So I think those kinds of leaders, for better or for worse, will emerge in Clubhouse and sort of be the dominant personalities over time. They will literally have individual cults of personality.
Yeah, if you thought Donald Trump was scary on Twitter, imagine Clubhouse.
I'm interested in what makes something interesting. I think part of it is novelty, like Naval was mentioning earlier. So if you break down novelty, it seems to be a few things. One is, did you say something counter-narrative? So something against what people are told is how the world works. Or maybe something counterintuitive. Something to the effect of like, oh shit, I had no idea that's how the world works. I didn't realize that intuitively. Or is it shock and awe? Or is it a really elegant synthesis, maybe? So I
think it's all of those things are the same thing, which is truth. It's telling the truth. Either a truth that people didn't already know, or it's a truth they knew but couldn't articulate the right way, or it's a truth that they did know, could articulate, but were too afraid to say. It's all about truth. It is very difficult to speak truth in front of a large group of people, and it takes a lot of verbal skill and a lot of synthesis to do it. And yes, you can teach them something new, but eventually you'll run out of new things. So then a lot of it becomes about articulating old things in new ways. Like, what is wisdom, right? Wisdom cannot be communicated. It's something that has to be learned on your own, has to be experienced, and you synthesize it for yourself. Knowledge, we can collectively build knowledge. If you figure out how to build an airplane, then I can take your schematics and build the next airplane and improve upon it. But if I figure out, how to have a good love life, and that comes after lots of bad relationships, I can't pass that on to you. You have to figure that out for yourself. So wisdom has to be rediscovered by people one at a time. That said, what I can do is I can remind you of things that you already know. And the best way to do that is to get past cliches, because cliches are things you've heard too often. And I can re-articulate something that I've learned in a new way, so it strikes at the core of yourself and reminds you that, yes, I should keep that in mind. Thank you for re-articulating that for me. And so that is something you can get rewarded for, which is communicating truths. But these are truths that have to be learned individually, and you can only be reminded of, but can be re-articulated. So all of the 3 points you made, I think, fall under the category of truth.
Yeah, that resonates. So something like truth plus authenticity and not giving a fuck about the audience. There's something there. And there's one more component.
Well, they all go together. If you
truth is the ultimate.
Yeah, if you care what the audience thinks, then you're pandering to them, which means you're saying things you don't necessarily believe to get a certain reaction of the audience, and that's falsehood.
So my Twitter account, like, the reason it works is because I post the Gumroad financials every month. All the other tweets are fine and fun, but I think the reason that I have real skin in the game, because that's the only thing that matters. That's the thing that people judge me for. Am I running a successful business or not? Like, that would change everything about me. For the reason, my identity, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. But for other people and for the status game, that's the thing that really matters. And I think it just always goes back to, it's about truth, and it's about taking risks. It's about, you acknowledge, you have to find the truth to sort of succeed after you take the risk, but it's just about making bets and then succeeding in public. I think people talk about building in public all the time. That's not what's important. What's important is succeeding in public.
I don't think that's true. I know that's your perception of why you think you might have credibility, but I don't think that's true at all. I think
feel free to tell me why my tweets are better than I think.
No, your tweets stand on their own. They're good tweets. You have a lot, some of them are derivative of mine, so I forgive that. You did come after me on Twitter, so I grabbed all the good stuff early. Well, I came in early and I timestamped all the good stuff, so everyone else looks derivative, so fine. But yeah, so some of them are derivative. Some of them are obvious, but you have some really good tweets. You have a lot of tweets that make me stop and think. And not a lot of people on Twitter do that. There's a lot of wisdom in your tweets. It comes from your pain. I knew you when you were young and insufferable, right? You didn't have much interesting to say. You had a lot of technical things to say, but you didn't have much wisdom to you. It's only when Gumroad almost died and you suffered over it that you gained the wisdom, and then your tweets started getting really good because your internal thinking got really good. The Gumroad thing itself, I think that's a scar tissue that you have because Gumroad almost failed. So for you think it's important that Gumroad has to succeed for you to be taken credibly. Just like when Gumroad was failing, you thought that no one was taking you credibly. Neither of those were true. I think you were your own worst critic, which is fine. That's what it takes for a successful entrepreneur. A successful entrepreneur is their own worst critic. But you could stop tweeting the Gumroad financials tomorrow, and I don't think anybody would care. Your credibility is not derived from how Gumroad is doing. There are a lot of people who are incredibly successful financially who put out tweets that are complete garbage.
That's the shortest bio I've ever written.
Sorry, what's that? What's the shortest bio?
I was making a joke, just like that was a better bio than anything else.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, yes. Bio
It's difficult because like the answer is it's simple. We know what we need to do to be successful in all of the different fields. We know how to be a good writer, write a lot. We know how to be a good startup person, like find customers, understand them, solve a problem, build a product. These things are just hard. And so we look for like, oh, maybe these other things matter, but like we all kind of know what matters. Like we kind of know what's necessary in order to succeed in many different pursuits. It's just like everyone knows how to have a six pack. Everyone knows how to get ripped. that information's been out there for a long time. So what we really want is we want people to just show that they've actually done it. They've put in the work and the time. They've taken the risk. They've got to the truth of what makes someone healthy, what actually works, and then their output is just evidence that they got to the truth. And that's sort of the
you don't want a sick doctor or a fat trainer, or my favorite is these life coaches whose own lives are in shambles, or these executive coaches who have never built a business. The unfortunate part is like a truly great executive coach should have built a successful business, and those people are generally unhireable or they're extremely expensive. Of course, all the people selling get rich quick advice, for $20, like that's all complete nonsense. All the people giving you stock tips or crypto tips on Twitter, complete nonsense. These are all fake signals. It's surprising to me actually how many people fall for them. It's kind of sad.
Why do you think people fall for them? Is it just like at sort of each tier of the game, like of each status tier, there's sort of like it actually makes sense to play the status game to get to the top to kind of get to the next phase, or how do you think about that?
Well, there's some amount of unfakeable knowledge or unbuyable knowledge. There's some things that just cannot be purchased in the market, right? So what can't be purchased in the market? So I have a tweet about this that I often refer back to myself, which is a fit body, a calm mind, and a house full of love. These things cannot be bought. They must be earned. And so those three things are things that are unfakeable signals. You have to go and get them yourself, regardless of how much money you have. And we're used to kind of getting everything in our lives with money, even though we can't get those three things. There's actually a fourth one that's a little more subtle, which is important, which I would just call kind of, I don't have a good name for it, but it's sort of just knowledge about how to like deal with situations. You can't necessarily buy that judgment. Let's call it judgment, right? So let's say that, for example, that you are, like this happened to a friend of mine recently. He broke his ankle, okay, and he has to decide whether or not to get surgery. And of course, if he goes to the surgeons, they all say, yeah, you need surgery. And if he goes to non-surgeon doctors or people who are doing yoga or massages, they'll say, well, massages are good for you, or yoga will fix you. So and he has a short period of time to figure out whether or not to get the surgery before his ankle could potentially heal in a way that's catastrophic for the long term. So no amount of money will help him make this decision, because he's not an expert in ankles himself. So he has to figure out who to trust. And it's the who to trust problem that is the core problem. It's like, for example, if you're president of the United States and you're in the country and the NSA comes up to you and says, Russia's about to attack us, we need to sneak attack them first. And the CIA comes in and says, no, actually, this is a fake signal. Don't listen to the NSA. Like, how is the president going to know? Right? He doesn't, because he doesn't have his own core expertise in the topic. So it becomes a very difficult situation. So there's certain kinds of knowledge and judgment that just cannot be bought with any amount of money. You just have to figure it out. You have to figure out who to trust. It's the picking experts problem. So anyway, those four things, which is knowledge that helps you make decisions, aka judgment, plus a healthy body, plus a calm mind, plus a loving household. These things, you just have to work at them. And so the one remaining thing, which is money, is the universal adapter, right? That money can solve pretty much every other problem. So people know that, so they want the money. And there's a certain desperation and a certain hunger for money in our society, which I kind of feel bad about, which is why I did partially all the how to get rich work to help people figure out the principles of making money or creating wealth, I should say. It's that people are so desperate for how to figure that out that even when they know that this thing is probably scammy, is probably a waste of time, this guy probably doesn't know what he's talking about, he might have a good tidbit in there, right? They're so desperate. And it's a little sad because making money, as I was saying, it's an inevitable byproduct of learning. And that's not the road people are able to go down. A lot of times they've already completed a university degree, might be a single mom, might not have any avenue to making money, might be a factory worker, might be a Starbucks, what have you. And they're like, oh man, I really, really need to figure out how to break out of this. I need to figure out how to make real money. And these people are desperate. And so to them, it's like, okay, well, I'll spend the $20. I'll go to the seminar. I'll listen to this guy. He does seem to dress well. He does drive a sports car. Maybe he has some clue, but they don't even know where to start. And I feel bad for those people. And, thanks to Eric, the Naval exists and it's out there. And hopefully people will read at least some principles of wealth creation. And at least at a high level, be able to, make some good decisions and differentiate from charlatans and get-rich-quick schemes from having real judgment, real learning that can help them make money and learning leverage. Leverage is actually the biggest piece of it. Accountability, great. You can make it big without accountability. Even specific knowledge, like very important, but you can actually make it without specific knowledge. But if you don't have leverage, you're never going to make real wealth. So leverage is actually probably the most important component of the principles I've discussed.
I feel like you did us a big favor by labeling that leverage and just putting the big buckets in place. I'll tell you.
Yeah, the idea of leverage is as old as the hills. I don't take any credit for pushing that. But I think the pieces. Let me tell you the two pieces that I didn't read elsewhere that I thought I uniquely figured out for myself. One was specific knowledge, and then the whole thing around specific knowledge. How do you build it? Well, it feels like play to you, but it looks like work to others. And it's something that you probably intrinsically already possess since you were a child or, learn through intense curiosity. The second piece is permissionless leverage, which is obvious. I mean, it has no marginal cost of replication for these products, which is breaking it out as the newest form of leverage and using that, whenever possible. I like to think that those were kind of at least somewhat unique improvements upon the leverage framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still seeing the results of that, especially the permissionless leverage piece. Like that is just dominating the results of the world, and that snowball, the cascading effect that type of leverage is having is still.
You want to be early too. Like leverage, over time, leverage gets proliferated. Like leverage spreads. It's kind of like profitability economics, right? Like it sort of tends to zero. Yeah. So ultimately, people find out where it spreads, and so a simple way to find leverage is to just go where very few people are. Like a gold rush is literally this, right? Like Naval went here with all his amazing tweets, and now I'm like stuck with like the scraps. So your Clubhouse is a great example of this. Like go to a new social platform. There's less, people have less residual followers. You can prove yourself as interesting earlier. Obviously you have to find the right platform for you. It's not, it's not just like the newest one.
I'm sorry to tell you, Sahil, but I beat you to this one too. So.
I know.
Sorry. Third time's the charm.
One of the things that haunted me the most on like Naval on your topic from sort of the hucksters get rich quick scheme was something you said in the book that's like the penalty for greed is that your desire for more money is delivered as soon as you earn some money, and that it's just so hard to not want that next increment, and every individual win makes you want and keep striving for that next one. And I feel like that is probably a huge contributor to kind of the how those get rich quickers continue to proliferate.
The problem is that the desire to make money is very hard to turn off. It's not like you can turn it on at max and then you can turn it off at some preset number. And that desire to make money will keep you relatively unhappy and keep you from enjoying your money. There's nothing so common, and unfortunately, most of the people that I know who are in this category are like that. There's nothing so common as the unhappy billionaire. You find these incredibly wealthy people, but their personal lives are underdeveloped, and they themselves are sort of just repeating what they did that got them here, and they aren't necessarily becoming any happier. And they're not necessarily unhappy, or they wouldn't characterize it as such, but they fall into one of those traps of like, well, that's just the kind of person I am, and I'm not meant to be happy, or, happiness is for fools, or blah, 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 or how do you define happiness anyway? Whenever you see any of those defensive postures, the person's basically not happy. It's like if you ask someone like, if you ask a child, like, are you happy, a young child, they'll usually just tell you yes, or they're just too busy being happy for you to even discuss it with them. But there's a certain kind of person who, when you ask them, are you happy? They'll say, well, I don't believe in happiness. Or what does happiness mean? Or define happiness, her, right? They might as well just say, yeah, I'm unhappy, right? And it doesn't have to be an extreme thing. Happiness doesn't mean that you're running around with a smile on your face all the time. It just means that you're relatively content with your life. Your day-to-day experience of life is highly positive, and you're happy to continue it, and it's not too dependent upon external circumstances. Well, if you got there through an unrelenting desire for money, believe me, there's no number that's going to turn off at. That's a scorecard that just doesn't stop. And so excessive greed, excessive not being defined as a societal metric, but just being defined on a personal metric, it occupies your mind constantly. And I'm not speaking this as some holier than thou sage that has conquered this. I'm speaking this as a victim of this, which is no matter how much money I make, it's never enough. It always occupies my mind. And it's always a constant source of anxiety. I can't turn it off. That's why I'm the wealth creation guy, because I obsessed over it. And that obsession is hard to get rid of. And all I can kind of do is acknowledge, like, okay, this is the mental disease that I have. And I just kind of have to deal with it. And maybe eventually I'll realize that the cost of the disease is too high and I'll drop it. But until then, I'm resigned to living with it.
So there's not ever a point that you consciously made a decision to reprioritize, like what you were going after in life?
Yeah, I don't do a lot of conscious planning, or if I do, it sort of falls apart anyway. I just find life is a lot better if it's lived spontaneously. Obviously, I have that luxury now, so I can do that. But I read some tweet today. Someone was basically saying, like, if you had all the money in the world, and if you could travel to all the places, you would want to travel to, what would you do with your life? And I reflected on it for a second. It's like, yeah, it's basically what I'm already doing with my life. So by every possible definition, I have enough, and yet. There was a day a couple of months back where I was sitting on a beach, and it was a beautiful beach, Caribbean style, not actually in the Caribbean, but powder white sand, and, beautiful warm ocean. And I'm sitting there, there's a nice breeze, and there's a sunset. And I'm just kind of hanging out there, and everything was perfect with the world, right? And this is the point where I, as the author, am supposed to have some epiphany about how great life is and how I should be grateful. But that's not what happened. Instead, I realized, actually, the thoughts that are going through my head, my mood, the quality of my life is exactly the same as when I'm sitting in my living room, or when I'm sitting in my bedroom and on my iPad, or I'm just meditating, or I'm just walking around, or I'm just looking out the window, or I'm talking to somebody. It was no better and no worse. Being in this highly privileged position didn't actually change anything. So it really is true that your worldview is your world. It's just a single player game going on inside your head. There can be, for example, 5 of us are here talking tonight, and we're all having roughly the same experience. We're staring at our phone, and we're engaging in a conversation in Clubhouse. And I assume that all of us are relatively warm and clothed and fed and comfortable. Yet the internal quality of our minds and lives is completely different. You can have 2 people walking down the street. One's really happy, one's really unhappy, but they're actually in the same physical environment having roughly the same experience. So it's really all about mindset and mind control. If your mind is out of whack, your life is out of whack. I don't know where I was going with this, but it's all an internal game. It's all single player. And yeah, making more money beyond a very early point doesn't actually change anything in your mindset. There's definitely a threshold where you need to get to where you're relatively comfortable. And there are multiple checkpoints. Like, obviously, if you don't have to show up to work anymore, if you're semi-retired, either because you're doing something you love, or because you made enough money, or just because that's how you live your life, and you just chose to live without money, and even without doing work, which is perfectly valid, then you have a lot of flexibility, and it gives you another improvement point in your life. I do think people underestimate how much misery schedules bring to your life. I see a lot of very successful, wealthy people who just have busy calendars. And sometimes I get guilty of it too, and I fill up my calendar. But there's nothing that brings me as much joy and happiness as an empty calendar, where you can just be spontaneous with your day. Doesn't mean you don't do anything, but you just do the things that are important and that you want to do, as opposed to be going through a day of obligation.
Yeah, I think that's a good like intermediate threshold. Daniel Vassallo was on here earlier, and he said like kind of something similar. He's like, I basically rearranged my life priorities as soon as I realized that I could have all my time back and not change too much about my materials.
Yeah, I say basically like you want 100% free time. That's the goal. It's like 24 hours of free time a day. And once you have that, then you have time. So then you can start spending that time towards and all of the other things you might want to do. But I think a shared goal for almost everybody is to basically have 24 hours of free time a day. Like that seems reasonable.
Yeah, one model that might be helpful, just to jolt people awake on that, is, and I didn't make this up, I read this somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't remember the original author, but we're all born time billionaires. And we just get poorer with time as we go on and on and on, as we spend our time. You know, Warren Buffett probably is a time millionaire, and I'll bet you he really wishes he could be a time billionaire, but the time billions are gone, and what's left are the money billions, but he can't trade those back for time. Ask any rich person, how much money they would give up to be 10 years younger, and I think most of the sane ones would tell you all of it.
I mean, ultimately, that's the thing you can't leverage. It's the only thing you can't leverage is time.
Well, I guess that's a question is like, at what point do you stop focusing on, it leverages, I think, the answer to like, are you trying to do more and more and more and more, or are you trying to stay steady with less time?
I think it's like being fit, like you, I think is you're just idling. Like you're unless you're like, at above a certain weight, that is probably more than most people weigh. Like you're not going to die early, like your life is relatively what you want it to be. And the same, you're just kind of like, I don't know, just filling your time doing things that you hopefully enjoy doing. But like, as long as you stay within that band.
Yeah, maybe like, tactically, like how do you protect your time and ensure that, especially being like public figures, everybody up here has at least a few thousand followers here and many more on Twitter. Like, how do you protect your time and ensure that you have that or work towards that 24-hour?
Say no to everything, delete emails without flinching, without responding, without flinching, walking meetings only, keep making them short, ask them to do it by email and text instead. There's lots and lots of techniques. 2-factor auth for your calendar. Basically, if you agree to a meeting, then don't actually agree. Wait 24 hours, make a note to yourself, go back and see if in 24 hours you agree. Another rule I have is if you wouldn't take the meeting now, then you probably won't want to take it later. These are all just reminders. Obviously, I still end up overscheduled and with too many meetings, but you basically just have to keep meetings off your calendar, 30-minute meetings instead of hour meetings. No pleasantries. If you've ever done a meeting with me, you'll know I just don't bother with pleasantries, either introductory or goodbyes. Right? Let's just cut to the meat of it. So there's lots of techniques, but what all it boils down to is, there's a line, the destination creates the avenue. So if you are completely convinced that meetings are generally a plague and you want to do as few of them as possible and you hate them with a passion, then you will find ways to not do meetings.
Naval, I have never gotten emails faster from anyone or shorter from anyone as consistently from you. Like no more than 10 words, no more than 10 minutes. If you're ever going to reply, if
I'm ever going to reply, right? But most of the time I don't reply. Yeah, most people I don't reply to most of the time. I used to have for years. I used to have an autoresponder set up on my email, which just said indiscriminately to everybody because Gmail, unfortunately, doesn't let you be too discriminating about it. But it just said, I am off the grid and not checking messages.
That's it. I think that's still
my email autoresponder for years. Oh, is it? I thought I'd turn it off, but one of the things I've realized is that in email, people are really good at creating work for you. Right? A lot of inbound emails, somebody else had a whim and created a task for you and then stuck it in your inbox and it's like, here's a to-do for you. And you have no obligation to respond. You have no obligation to engage.
A simple rule that I really like is, do I have to do this? And if the answer is no, don't do it ever. Because the things you have to do, you are already doing. So just, basically don't respond to anything that you don't need to respond to, which should be very, very few emails over time. I think another tip is don't consume shit. Like, don't spend your time like consuming a bunch of crap. Like, so many people complain about how little free time they have and how busy they are, and then they tell me like the intricate details of Game of Thrones. And I'm not saying this to be holier than thou. Like, I just happen to not care as much. But you just have, ultimately, like, there's time in lots of places. Like, if you actually break down 24 hours a day, it can be a lot of time.
Saying I don't have time is another way of saying it's just not a priority, right? It's just you want to spend your time the way you want to spend it. And if you want to be productive, then don't. I actually think watching movies, TV, news, sports, it's largely a waste of time. Video games, largely a waste of time. Not to say I didn't do it. I spent large portions of my life watching all of those things and playing tons of video games. But at some point or another, I just started viewing them as a waste of time. Honestly, I read a ton of fiction books, and I now view most fiction books as a waste of time. It's very hard for me to engage in fiction because I'm just like, all right, cut to the chase. Tell me what the new interesting thing to learn is. Because I just read too many of them. I'll recognize the storyline, the archetype. I can kind of see where it's headed. And I just have a hard time caring about these fictional characters because I myself am too conscious of my semi-fictional life where I'm dying 1 second at a time and I have no time left. I don't have time to read about this person who doesn't exist to learn some life lesson that I either already know or more succinctly elsewhere. Time is literally everything. It's incredibly precious. There's nothing more precious than time. Literally nothing more precious.
This is maybe a weird question for like anybody but you, but like you have at least financially like total control over your time, right? And no obligations necessarily, and it sounds like not a preference for a lot of like, not infinite appetite for recreation or fiction. It's like, and a deep appreciation for what that time is. I've heard you say that like a number of times, and it resonates. And I like, but what do you do with this time? Like, that's so precious. Clubhouse.
Whatever I feel like in that moment. And it can be a waste of time according to somebody else's definition. But whatever I feel like in that moment is the right thing for me to do. And that's what I aspire to. I'm not saying that's where I am most of the time, but that is what I aspire to. And most of my desires are fairly mundane. It's play with the kids. It might be go make an investment. It might be brainstorm some startup. It might be learn something new. It might be read a book. It might be go for a run. It's all the same stuff everybody else does. But I just want to be able to do what I want when I want. That's all. And by the way, by most people's definition, I might just be wasting a lot of time. Like right before I got in this clubhouse, I was socializing and I was playing with my kids, right? That's not quote unquote productive time, but it's what I wanted to do at that moment.
Do you, looking back at like how much earlier you could have had that experience? Like, do you lament those years maybe that you could have gotten that free time back and lived more at your whim?
No, the past is a fiction. The past is a fiction. Don't spend any time thinking about the past. It doesn't exist. It's not real.
Yeah.
No one can time travel back.
More advice then.
Yeah.
Or
no, it's a complete waste of time to think about the past. There's nothing there. You can't go back. Yeah, maybe if you have some important lessons to learn, but those lessons can be learned pretty fast. You can synthesize that data very quickly. There's no need to reminisce upon the past. I think people get trapped. A lot of people are sorting out their past when the past is just entirely contained in your head. It's not anywhere else. And so the easiest way is just to kind of get over any problems or reinterpret them in a way that it serves you and just move on, because the present is all that actually exists. So that's where you live. That's where you exist. That's what you got to spend time on and time within. And any moment where you're not present, you're literally squandering time. So I had this thought today, actually, coincidentally, which is, what is a good use of time? How should time be spent, right? How do you know that you're getting the most out of every moment? And so then I was like, okay, well, I want the time to be useful and engaging, and I don't want to be too mentally disturbed or anxious while I'm in that time. So what is that? Well, there's flow state. I could be in flow, but flow, the way that it was defined narrowly in that famous book, I forget the author's name, but it's like a difficult Russian or Polish name, but so forgive me for that. But the way flow was defined in that book was that you were engaged in a task at the edge of your capability, where you were good enough at it that you could actually pull it off, but not so good at it that it wasn't challenging to you. So you're doing challenging work at the edge of your capability, and that's flow, and that's a good use of time. Well, that's like a couple hours a day. That's not good enough. What about the rest of my day? And so I thought about it, and like, really what you want out of your time is you want to be in flow every moment. And how do you get into flow every moment, whether you're brushing your teeth or walking the dog or reading a book or speaking on Clubhouse? Well, you have to do it in such a way that you're completely engaged, you're fully aware, you're completely present. What does that mean? That means that your mind isn't running out of control. So ultimately, if you don't want to waste time, your mind has to be under control. And you can't control your mind. It's an uncontrollable monkey. Now we're in catch-22 land. So all you can do is be aware of your mind being out of control, because that gives you a level of detachment from your mind that then lets you be in flow. So the very, very subtle answer to the very difficult question of how you should spend your time, the answer is by being self-aware within every moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they try to get better, but it's just become more observant of who you are, and you will automatically just get better. Like if you could, or you don't, but all you can control is just being aware of what you're doing. There's just far too much going on, where you were born, what languages you speak, who you were born to. Like there's so many variables that this present moment consists of. All you can do is just observe as much of it as possible.
Well, you are a play of a set of infinite forces launched from the Big Bang, intersecting at this precise moment. Your inputs into that and your ability to control that are incredibly limited, if they exist at all. So the best thing to do is, of course, function to the best of your capability, but just be as aware as possible, as self-aware as possible, because you're always aware of the environment around you, right? So your awareness always extends in the environment. The problem is it extends too far out into the environment. You lose your self-awareness. Then your mind starts running crazy. You're constantly reacting to things. The moment slips away from you because you're lost in the past or the future, which don't really exist, and your time is wasted. But if you are immersed in the activity because your mind is quiet, and generally it's quiet because you're self-aware of it when it's running around, then there's a certain level of flow state that you can enter into your everyday life, and that is time well spent.
And my little hack for this is just trying to zoom in, right? Like even the tiniest bite of food or sip of water or whatever can be a deeply immersive experience and pull you into the present.
Well, it's like the first level was 100% free time, and then the second level is 100% flow state.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and it doesn't. The beauty is, if you get 100% flow state, it doesn't even have to be free time. So free time, in a sense, is a crutch. It's a crutch because you don't know how to be immersed in whatever it is that you're doing. And a truly present person, almost like an enlightened Buddha-like being, would be perfectly happy whether he or she was busting rocks in a chain gang, or playing video games, or sitting there and staring out into space.
Well, I had a tweet today. It said, if we often use this term at Gumroad, like we want to help creators earn a living doing what they love, and I sort of joked like the easiest way to make a living is doing what you love is to fall in love with making money. Like if you love the act of doing it, then inherently, and it's kind of the same with all of these things. You just fall in love with it.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're basically saying there then is fall in love with life itself, which is hard for most people to do. It's not easy.
So you either make life better so that you fall in love with it, or you become okay with falling in love with what you currently have. Like both, I think life is like basically both of those things for everybody to some degree.
Well, one of my favorite tweets of all time is by Charlie Knowles, who I followed on Twitter for a while, and he tweeted that at the end of the day, you have to believe that either everything is a miracle or nothing is. And that's a very deep statement. Basically, if you believe in a single miracle, like for example, if the Holy Spirit just popped up and performed one miracle in front of you, that means then there are miracles everywhere, because you can't take anything for granted. Everything has to be a miracle. Or you're completely atheistic and you believe that there are no miracles, that it was all just kind of random. But that one simple the answer to that one simple question will basically define your entire worldview. But it has to be an authentic answer. Unfortunately, we're mostly agnostic.
It's funny. It's so easy to find out if you're happy, which is like at this moment, everyone can ask themselves, like, at this moment, do I have what I want? Would I change something about this moment? I personally would not right now. Then you're happy. And if there is a change that you want, if you want it, you can either stop wanting it. That's sort of maybe preferred and the cheapest option, or you get what you want. And then maybe you like, those are just the two outcomes. It's kind of like what you said, life is, what is it? 2 questions, right? What do you want? And did you get it?
On the time savings front from earlier, there's this notion of sort of the decay of perceived urgency. So I try to disallow people from booking with me in the next couple weeks out, try to push it 3-4 weeks out. What happens is the week of, I usually find myself asking, oh, this is actually not nearly as important nor urgent as I thought it was, and I just cancel it. And that's been pretty high ROI for me for just clearing out my calendar. Earlier, Sahil, you were mentioning why do people fall prey to credentialism? Like the whole clubhouse bio idea. I was thinking about that. I think part of it is if you lack the skill to discern one's output for yourself, like some guru, they say they're good at something, you then have to over-index on credentials and awards as proxies for their competency or their status. And what happens is people who have themselves not won awards overvalue awards, whereas people who've won awards don't value them very highly because they realize their bias and arbitrariness. And so you're kind of stuck in this rut of, I think the best way to get out of it is essentially to build the taste or find the agency to determine for yourself one's competency if you're going to pay attention to them.
Yeah, I was reading Jed McKenna recently. He had this great line, which is like, there's no, like, the concept of wrongness is wrong. There's no nothing is wrong. The universe just is. It's fucking weird, but it just is.
Well, yeah, it all boils down to subjectivity. From the perspective of a single observer, things can be right or wrong. But on an objective, universe-wide basis, there's no such thing as right or wrong. But of course, if you believe, which I think most of us do, that you're a single instance animal in a specific location at a specific time, then you do need to have a concept of right and wrong to function. Jed McKenna, for those of you who read him, he doesn't believe that. He believes that he's the entire universe. He's consciousness itself. And so, therefore, to him, it's clear that there is no such thing as right or wrong because he's trying to be completely objective. It's a God's eye view upon humanity, which I don't think most of us have.
But is that something like worth attaining? Or if you want it, I guess. If it makes you happy to get, then fine.
It's not the question of whether it's worth attaining or not. It's a question of, is it true or not? Are you awareness itself, or are you a single instance of that awareness in a simian body? So it's a question of truth. If you're wanting it, it's sort of silly because Jed himself doesn't believe he exists. Now we're getting pretty existential here, but you have to have read this character to know what we're talking about. But Jed doesn't believe that there is a person named Jed McKenna who's like a real being. And so there's no one there to go get that, to go attain that, right? Enlightenment is a booby prize. It's realizing you don't exist and that you are just raw awareness and nothing else. So there's no way to want it, because the thing that wants it, the you that wants it, disappears upon getting there. Or disappears upon the realization, I should say. It's ego suicide. Not for everybody.
I mean, that is kind of flow state, right? Like, I think flow state is like sort of temporary ego suicide, ego death.
That's right. Yeah, your mind goes away for a bit. It really helps if you don't care about your own survival, though, because it's very hard to figure out how you would really accept such a state and still be. You would be basically functional, but whether you would be long range planning functional or not is a different story.
Yeah, I mean that is something I've thought about. Is like, is there some, like, there's always going to be some latent amount of suffering. Life is suffering. Like, you just can't get rid of that, right?
You can't get rid of suffering until you get rid of joy either, right? They're just opposite sides of the same coin. If you didn't define one event as joyous, then you wouldn't define another event as suffering, right? It's like every time you create a friend, you create the basis for an enemy. So it's just the game that we're all playing. I mean, that's the life you got to live, ups and downs, lefts and rights. That's what makes it interesting. Otherwise, as Jed McKenna says, it's just, he also says enlightenment is a booby price. It's nothing forever. That doesn't sound that compelling to me. But if it's a truth, it's the truth, right? He got there because he was obsessed with truth seeking and not necessarily with what was better for him or worse for him.
Awesome. Well, let's call it a wrap. That was Leverage.
Sounds good to me. Thanks, everybody.
Coming, everybody.
Have a great night.
Yeah.
Great night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.